Welcome back to Chapter 2 of Introduction to the Old Testament on the chapter Geography of the Old Testament. Please have your PowerPoint number 2 open and proceed to slide number 2. The physical world of the Old Testament is known as the Ancient Near East. We abbreviate it ANE if you see that in writing, which today includes mostly the Middle East and sometimes parts of Southwest Asia. Proceed to slide number 3. In the third slide, you can see the Fertile Crescent, referring to the best agricultural lands in the ancient Near East. Of course, you can see that's the green area on the map, and the rest is the brown area, which is not so fertile, not too good for agriculture or for grazing. Nevertheless, there were cultures that Bedouins and so forth throughout history that would also be through that land, just going from place to place, trying to find water and so forth. So there was still a rich culture, but more of a nomadic culture. But it's in the Fertile Crescent that you see where the major ancient kingdoms rose up. You can see the area called Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers, referring to the Euphrates River below and the Tigris River above. And then you see Syria, Palestine, as some call it, the name given to the region of the kingdoms of Syria, Phoenicia, and Ugarit. Now those are not on the map, but you may hear of them again. And also Canaan, which would become Israel and Judah, and eventually just Israel. And the Fertile Crescent extends to Egypt along the Nile River and the Delta Plain. The history of Israel begins in northern Mesopotamia, the home of the Israelite prophets, Abram, before his name was changed to Abraham. Later, Israelite history was greatly influenced by the empires of Mesopotamia in Assyria, Babylonia, and Persia. And Asia Minor was the home of the Hittites, who fought with Egypt for control of the Syro-Palestine area. Proceed to slide number 4. Slide 4 gives you a general comparison of the location of many ancient kingdoms on the left with modern countries on the right. Notice the map to the left, the ancient kingdoms of Babylonia, Akkad, Assyria, the Hittites, Syria, and the land of the different Canaanite tribes, and Egypt, who mostly ruled the land of Canaan at that time. So this was around 1300 BC and earlier. Notice the location of the city of Ur, right along the Euphrates, pretty close to where Kuwait is, but actually located in modern Iraq. And this is where many believe was the location of Abram and his family's first home, Terah, his father. And then they moved northward to the location of Haran. Haran is in modern-day Turkey, where Abraham's family moved after Ur, and where Abram and Sarah left with Lot to travel to Canaan. You can also see Padan Aram, right near Haran, where modern Syria is located. And that's where Abraham's servant traveled to find a wife for Isaac, Rebekah, and where Jacob fled from Esau, and where he married Leah and Rachel, and where Rachel died. You can also see it's quite a hike from Haran and from Padan Aram to Canaan from there. Slide 5 gives you a picture of the beehive house style in Haran, which is in modern Turkey today, dating back to around 2000 BC, the time of Isaac and Jacob. Jacob might have seen and perhaps even lived in these style of houses. We don't know that for sure, but we do know the dating of these houses and the location, so they certainly would have at least seen them. Slide 6 is just for those of you who are interested in exploring further the extent of the various ancient kingdoms in comparison with the location of modern countries today. So if you want to stop and explore that and put me on pause, go right ahead. Or if you want to just pause me and look at any of these other maps, for those of you who enjoy that, proceed. Slide number 7, along with slide number 4, are helpful to easily identify some key geographic locations, I should say key to the biblical story. You will be required to be able to identify the general location of the major ancient kingdoms of Egypt, the location of Sinai, Syria, where the Hittites were, Babylonia, Assyria, and Persia. You will also be required to identify the locations of Canaan, Israel and Judah, Moab and Eden, and those are on slide 4 as well as in your book. The land of Egypt featured prominently in Israel's history throughout, even through the time of Jesus. Abraham journeyed in Egypt, probably during the Second Intermediate Period, which was right about 1786 Moses also led the Israelites during the time of the New Kingdom, and Egypt also played a role in later Israelite history. The language and literature of the Hebrew Bible demonstrates significant cultural, linguistic, and possibly religious influences from Egypt. And we'll talk about these more in the next 2 sessions. The northern region of the Arabian Peninsula was the home of the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Amalekites, and the Midianites, all of whom often appear in Israelite history as well. In slide number 8, discusses rivers and waterways and seas, which were of vital importance to ancient cultures for agriculture, as well as for trade, as they remain important today, and especially in cultures without irrigation systems. Without adequate rain and access to water, famine killed so many and occasionally played a role in wiping out nations. In Egypt, the Nile was important for the monumental building projects that we can still see there, from the pyramids and tombs to statues, great cities, and storehouses. The Nile was also vital for agriculture. Once a year, the Nile would fill up with rainwater and flood the land, called an inundation. This inundation brought nutrients with the water to nourish their crops. In the picture, you can see the benefit and importance of the Nile to Egypt still today. The only really green places in Egypt are those along the Nile. Even yet today, they have not developed their irrigation systems in ways such as Israel has, for example, and certainly many other places of the world. Slide 9 shows the land of ancient Israel and Judah with the location of each tribe assigned land through Moses. So we will be coming back to that, of course, later on as well in this class. The land of Israel became the geographic and the theological center of the ancient world. Here, Judaism, Christianity, and eventually Islam originated. This region is divided into the coastal plain along the Mediterranean, the Central Hill Country, or mountains, running through the middle of the land, and in between, the Transjordan Plateau, or mountains and Central Mountains, or Hill Country. In between is the Jordan Rift Valley, which runs south of the Dead Sea to north of the Sea of Galilee. The Dead Sea, known in the Bible as the Salt Sea, is the lowest point on earth. Any of you who've traveled to Israel probably had the opportunity to float in the Dead Sea, which is quite a strange experience. You do not want to even get any of that in your mouth or in your eyes. You can also see some gaps on that map along the Central Mountains, right around Megiddo. Can you see it there? More wars have been fought at Megiddo than in any other place in the world or in history. Megiddo is a wide-open flat plain with openings to the east and to the south, to the waters of the Mediterranean. Napoleon called it the ideal battlefield, and even Napoleon fought there. It is also known later in the New Testament as Armageddon, and the last of the battles will be fought there as well. The land of Canaan was also and is immense theological significance to the Israelites, for God promised this region to Abraham in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. The land was an important part of God's covenant with Israel. God continued to promise that land to them as a nation. It was the goal of and the reward for obedience to the covenant. In fulfillment of the covenant, Joshua led the Israelites in a holy war to remove the indigenous people of the land. And we'll discuss this more later as well, because many people have questions about this. Integrated into the covenant was the concept that if Israel failed to obey God's covenant with them and their covenant with Him, that they too would be displaced from the land. And this, of course, did take place after centuries of warnings and efforts of God to continue to draw them back to Himself. The land of Israel was exiled by Assyria and to Assyria, and Judah later on to Babylon. We discussed the meaning and the importance of covenant in the first chapter. The covenant between Yahweh and Israel is very similar to the Hittite treaty formula. If you recall on the map, the Hittite area is in Asia Minor, which is today's Turkey area mostly. And this covenant had a very particular form, and we can see how God was using things that people understood within that time to explain Himself to them. God always contextualizes, and that's one of the other problems people often have in reading the Old Testament. And one of the reasons people often think that it's strange, because each part of the Old Testament, written over a period of about 1,000 years, there were things happening in history, and God was speaking into history. He was speaking into their culture, using language and terms and imagery that they would understand. But in that, He was also speaking against the culture, how God was to be different, how they were to be different because of their relationship with God. And God always contextualizes. So learning about the Old Testament, there are eternal truths about God in them, but we have to realize He's speaking into a culture. And if you can understand some about that culture and that time and the language and the terms He was using, your appreciation for the passage will greatly be increased, as well as your understanding of God and how He communicates. It's actually a great tool for even helping us communicate as teachers and preachers. The land of Israel was promised Israel as part of the covenant. But Israel failed to completely conquer the inhabitants whose gods proved to be Israel's downfall. They continually kept trying to be like the people around them and kept turning into the people around them rather than being conformed into the people of God that He had called them to be. Instead of them changing their world, they became changed by the world. And that is what so much of the warning is for us continually and today. Go ahead to slide 10, please. From very early, this land of Canaan and Israel was a very important trade route because it connected Africa and Eurasia. The people of Israel were greatly influenced by the centrality of this region as foreign powers continually sought to gain control of the land. You'll see there were two major overland routes. One was called the Way of the Sea, and the other the Way of the Kings. We can still see this Way of the Kings today. It was first built back early in the time of Egypt's early kingdoms, and it continues. We can still trace, and there still is a road on the Way of the Kings through Israel today, and it goes right through Megiddo. The importance of the trade routes were for international diplomacy. There are letters that were sent between these different kingdoms, kings and rulers and governors that went along these trade routes. So diplomatic letters were exchanged, taxes and literature and spices and all different kinds of things were exchanged between all of these different kingdoms through the roadways. There was a development of a merchant class of people, and also religious information was exchanged between these cultures as well. So Israel became heavily influenced by foreign religions as well as foreign relationships. And once again, they kept wanting to be like the other nations. Slide 11 shows the major trade routes. And this particular map is from right around 1300 BC. So again, before Israel itself became a nation. But these trade routes continued during the time that Israel became a mighty nation and throughout its decline. These routes were already quite ancient, and so there was already much trade of supplies, literature, and language since early in the Egyptian Empire. From the picture, you can see that many of the trade routes, both by land and by sea, went right through the land that became Israel and Judah. You can also see from the trade routes that rivers and water were, of course, also important for trade. Sadly, the people were willing to trade their relationship with the unseen God for what everyone else had around them, gods that could be seen and manipulated. This is the story, and this is the wrestling match between Israel, between humanity and God. Time and again and again and again, God would call his people to himself, promising to protect, provide, and guide them, and time again would deliver them, if only they would place him above all others. But time again and again, they promised. But when troubles came, or enemies or famine, then they would run back to God after being defeated. But God would always listen. There were times he would turn away after they had done it too many times, and he would allow them to experience what life was like without him. But this is the cycle that we see from Genesis chapter 3 all the way until Revelation. So we'll trace this and we'll look at this. Pay attention to this theme of God's grace, his love, his covenant, his faithfulness, how he calls and draws, and people come and then they turn. And when they turn, they fall, they experience problems, and then they turn and call on God. But it, of course, is a little more complicated than that as well, and we'll be facing those questions. So as you're going along also, if there are particular questions that you have, go ahead and shoot me an email or send me a message through the forum. Slide number 12, the theological significance of the land. The land, as we mentioned, was a major component of God's promise to Abraham. There was the Holy War against the Canaanite inhabitants, and we'll discuss that more fully. And also, the relationship between God was contingent upon people's faith in God. So we will end this session here. Be sure to watch the video of Dr. John Munson on physical theology. This video explains the concept of physical theology by the international expert on this topic. And I believe that you will really enjoy it. It is filled with pictures and ideas and humor, even though he's a brilliant scholar. And I'm fortunate to be able to call him a good friend of mine as well, as I've had him as a professor in the past too. So enjoy the video from Dr. Munson. And in that you will see the land of the Bible as God's testing ground of faith. God bless you, and let me know if you have questions. Remember to read the material, let me know if you have problems, and take the quiz as well, and complete the forum questions. God bless you. See you next week.